Have you ever wondered what would happen if the two kings of the pirates stood on the same deck not as enemies but as crewmates? Imagine the sheer chaos of Monkey D. Luffy meeting Gol D. Roger in his prime. Today we are diving into a timeline where the future crashes into the past. The seas of the New World are treacherous and unpredictable, but nothing could have prepared the Straw Hat crew for the storm that swallowed the Thousand Sunny. It was not just wind and rain. The sky turned a violent shade of violet, and the ocean roared with a sound that vibrated in their very bones. Luffy, standing on the figurehead, laughed in the face of danger as he always did, but this time the lightning didn't just strike. It pulled. In a blink of blinding white light, the captain of the Straw Hats vanished, leaving his crew screaming his name into the empty howling wind. When Luffy opened his eyes, the smell of the sea was the same, but the ship beneath his boots felt different. The wood was darker, the design older, and the Jolly Roger waving above was not his own. He rubbed his head confused and looked around. This was not the Sunny. He was surrounded by men who looked like demons of the sea, hardened warriors drinking and laughing. But silence fell over the deck the moment they noticed the intruder. A young red-haired boy dropped his mop in shock. A man with a clown nose froze with a knife in his hand. And sitting on a crate radiating an aura that made the air heavy was a man with a magnificent mustache and a grin that mirrored Luffy's own. Luffy blinked. He looked at the red-haired boy and his eyes popped out of his skull. Shanks. He shouted, pointing a rubbery finger at the boy. Why are you so small? Did you shrink? The entire crew of the Oro Jackson stared in disbelief. This stranger had just fallen from the sky and insulted their apprentice. Before anyone could react, the Dark King Silvers Rayleigh was already in motion. His sword flashed, aiming for Luffy's neck to subdue the intruder. But Rayleigh did not expect what happened next. Luffy didn't panic. His observation haki flared. He tilted his head effortlessly, dodging the strike, and coated his arm in armament haki, clashing against Rayleigh's blade with a metallic ring that sent a shockwave across the ocean. The crew gasped. A random intruder blocking the vice captain was unheard of. Rayleigh's eyes narrowed behind his glasses, sensing a strength that shouldn't belong to such a young boy. "Who are you?" Rayleigh asked, his voice low and dangerous. Luffy tilted his head confused. "What do you mean, old man?" "It is me, Luffy. And why does Shanks have both his arms?" The tension on the ship was thick enough to cut with a knife, but then a loud, boisterous laughter broke the silence. It was the captain. Roger walked forward, stepping between Rayleigh and Luffy. He looked at the straw hat resting on Luffy's back. "That is a fine hat you have there, boy," Roger said, his eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and knowing. "It looks just like the one I gave to Shanks." Luffy looked at Roger, and for the first time he realized who he was looking at. The face he had seen on posters. The man Ace talked about with so much anger and sadness. "The king. You are the pirate king," Luffy blurted out. Roger grinned wider. "Not yet, boy. But I will be. I am Gol D. Roger, and you seem to be far from home." Luffy's stomach growled louder than the thunderstorm that brought him there. "I am hungry," Luffy complained, ignoring the fact that he was surrounded by legends. Roger stared at him for a second and then burst into laughter again. "I like this kid. Rayleigh, stand down. Let us feed him." And just like that, the tension evaporated, replaced by the smell of roasting sea king meat. As they ate, the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Luffy sat surrounded by the Roger pirates, stuffing his face. He sat next to Odin, who was fascinated by Luffy's stretching abilities, poking his rubber cheeks. Luffy told him he came from the future, though he barely understood the concept himself. He explained he was going to be the king of the pirates. Most crews would have mocked him, but the Roger pirates just listened. They sensed the power radiating from him. The voice of all things that Roger himself possessed seemed to hum around this boy. Shanks kept staring at Luffy, fascinated by the stories of his future self. "So I become a great pirate, huh?" the young apprentice asked, eyes shining. Luffy grinned, swallowing a massive chunk of meat. "The best. You gave me this hat." He tapped the straw hat. Roger watched the exchange carefully. He saw the fire in Luffy's eyes, a fire that matched his own. He realized that whatever force brought this boy here did it for a reason. They were close to the end of their journey. They were hunting for the road poneglyphs, preparing for the final voyage to the last island. And here was a boy who had already lived through the era they were trying to create. Suddenly, the ship rocked violently. It wasn't a storm this time. A massive fleet appeared on the horizon, dozens of ships forming a blockade. At the forefront stood a ship with a golden lion figurehead. It was Shiki the Golden Lion. He had found them again. The Roger pirates stood up, weapons drawn, ready for war. Roger finished his drink and stood up, his coat flapping in the wind. "It seems we have company," he said, grabbing his sword ace. Luffy swallowed his food and stood up, wiping grease from his mouth. He looked at the fleet and cracked his knuckles. "I can help," he said simply. Roger looked down at him, and for a moment he didn't see a boy. He saw a monster capable of destroying islands. He saw an equal. "Very well," Roger said, drawing his blade. "Let us show them what happens when you mess with the king's crew." The battle that followed was not a fight, it was a catastrophe. Shiki thought he had the numbers advantage, but he did not account for the wild card. Luffy launched himself into the air, activating Gear 4th Boundman. The Roger pirates watched in awe as the boy transformed, bouncing on the air coated in tribal hockey markings. With a single Kong gun, Luffy decimated 3 of Shiki's ships, sending splinters flying miles into the air. Roger laughed, delighted by the spectacle, slashing through waves of enemies with divine departure. It was a symphony of destruction, the past and the future fighting back to back. By the time the smoke cleared, Shiki's fleet was in ruins, forcing the Golden Lion to retreat, humiliated. The Oro Jackson sailed away victorious, the crew cheering for their new strange friend. That night, the party was legendary. But as the celebrations died down and the moon rose high, Roger sat alone with Luffy on the figurehead. "Hey, Luffy," Roger asked, his voice serious for the first time. "You know what lies at the end, don't you? You know what the One Piece is." Luffy looked at the horizon, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I don't," he lied. "But even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. It would be a boring adventure if I knew." Roger looked at him stunned, and then a smile of pure respect broke across his face. He poured 2 cups of sake. "You really are something else, Monkey D. Luffy." But as the two touched cups, a strange distortion rippled through the air. Luffy's hand flickered, becoming transparent for a second before solidifying again. The timeline was unstable. Luffy's presence here was breaking the laws of reality. But there was still time. They had not reached the final island yet. Roger stood up, looking north towards the next destination. "We are heading to pick up the last road poneglyph," Roger declared. "If you are going to fade away, kid, let's make sure you see the history you are trying to inherit. Let's go to Laughtail." Luffy grinned, adjusting his hat. "Yeah, let's go." But the journey wouldn't be easy. The Marines, led by a Prime Garp, were closing in, and the mysteries of the Void Century were waiting to be uncovered. And Luffy was about to learn that being the Pirate King required more than just strength. It required a will that could transcend time itself. The sea was never quiet around the Oro Jackson, but this silence was different. It was the calm before a catastrophe. The crew was on edge, eyes scanning the horizon, where a fleet of marine battleships was forming a wall of steel and justice. And leading the charge, standing on the bow of the lead ship with his coat crossed and fists clenched, was the hero of the Marines, Monkey D. Garp. Roger laughed, adjusting his coat, but there was a drop of sweat on his temple. Garp never gave up. He was a demon of persistence. Luffy leaned over the railing, squinting his eyes. Even from this distance, the aura coming off that man was terrifying. It felt like a mountain was about to fall on them. "That is my grandpa," Luffy mumbled. The crew froze, turning their heads so fast necks nearly snapped. Rayleigh adjusted his glasses, trying to process the absurdity. "Your grandfather is Garp the Fist." "Yeah, he hits really hard. Be careful." Before anyone could ask further questions, a cannonball flew towards them. But it wasn't fired from a cannon. Garp had thrown it with his bare hand. The iron ball moved faster than sound, breaking the sound barrier and screaming towards the Oro Jackson. Rayleigh stepped forward, drawing his sword and slicing the ball in half, but the impact shook the entire ship. Garp roared across the water, his voice amplified by sheer lung capacity. "Roger, I am not letting you escape this time. And who is that brat standing next to you? Hand him over." Roger grinned, drawing ace. "Come and get us, Garp." The battle began instantly. It wasn't a skirmish, it was a war of legends. The Marines boarded the Oro Jackson and chaos erupted. Scopper Gaben was fighting 3 vice admirals at once. Odin was dancing through the battlefield with his 2-sword style, cutting through steel like butter. But the center of the storm was Roger and Garp. Their hockey clashed with such force that the clouds above split open and the sea beneath them formed a whirlpool. Luffy jumped into the fray, aiming to help Roger. He launched a gum-gum pistol at a marine giant, knocking him out instantly. Garp paused mid-punch, looking at the stretching arm. "A devil fruit user," Garp grunted. He abandoned his duel with Roger and vanished. In a split second, he appeared in front of Luffy. The speed was incomprehensible. This was Garp in his absolute prime. He didn't use a technique, he just punched. A simple hockey-infused fist buried itself into Luffy's gut. Luffy's eyes rolled back. The pain was excruciating. It wasn't like the punches he took in the future. This was raw, unfiltered power. Luffy was sent flying, crashing through 3 cabins and smashing into the main mast, splintering the wood. Roger screamed Luffy's name and tried to intervene, but Sengoku had arrived, turning into his massive golden Buddha form, blocking Roger's path. Luffy lay in the rubble, coughing up blood. His body flickered again, becoming transparent. The timeline was rejecting him. He was weak. He watched as his future grandfather decimated the crew he had grown to love over the last few days. He saw Shanks cowering behind a barrel, terrified. He saw Roger struggling against 2 legends. If he didn't do something, this journey would end here. The Pirate King would never reach Laugh Tale. The future would be erased. Luffy's heart began to beat. It started slow, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder. Doom doot da da, doom doot da da. It wasn't just a heartbeat, it was a musical rhythm. The sound resonated across the battlefield, stopping Marines and pirates alike. Garp paused, looking around confused. What is that sound? Roger froze, pushing Sengoku back. He knew that rhythm. He had read about it in the ancient texts on Skypiea. Luffy stood up, but he wasn't the same. His hair turned white, flowing like flames. His clothes bleached into a pure divine white. A ring of clouds formed around his neck. He looked up and a smile stretched across his face, wide and cartoonish. He didn't look in pain anymore. He looked free. He burst into laughter, a sound so joyous it felt out of place in a war zone. Gear 5. Luffy bounced on the ground, but the wood didn't splinter, it turned to rubber. He looked at Garp and tilted his head, eyes popping out of his skull in a comedic fashion. Grandpa, you are so serious. Garp stared, mouth open. What in the world is this power? It doesn't make sense. Luffy launched himself forward, but he didn't run. He spun his legs like a cartoon wheel. He grabbed a lightning bolt from the storm brewing above and turned it into a rubber spear, hurling it at the marine ships. The sheer absurdity of the power turned the tide. Luffy grabbed the deck of the Oro Jackson and pulled it up like a carpet, shielding the crew from Sengoku's shockwave. He was laughing the entire time, bouncing off the air, turning the rigid, deadly battle into a playground. Roger watched Luffy fight, and a realization hit him like a thunderbolt. The man they were waiting for. The one who would turn the world upside down. It wasn't someone Roger would meet in his lifetime. It was this boy. Luffy was the one the poneglyph spoke of. Luffy grabbed Garp's giant fist. Garp tried to crush him, but Luffy's body molded around the punch, turning Garp's arm into a jump rope. I am having so much fun! Luffy yelled, spinning Garp around and throwing him towards his own ship. The golden lion figurehead on Garp's ship snapped off as the Vice Admiral crashed into it. Sengoku, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, ordered a tactical retreat. The Marines had lost the element of surprise and were facing a power they couldn't comprehend. As the Marine ships pulled back, battered and confused, Luffy's transformation faded. The white hair turned black, the clouds vanished, and he collapsed onto the deck, looking like a dried-up old man for a few seconds before returning to normal. The crew gathered around him, silent. They weren't looking at him like a friend anymore, but like a god. Roger walked through the crowd, his face serious. He knelt down beside Luffy. That form, Roger said softly. That heartbeat. You are him, aren't you? You are the sun god. Luffy blinked, tired and hungry. I am just Luffy. Roger laughed, a deep, hearty sound, but there were tears in his eyes. We were too early, Rayleigh. We arrived too early. But now I know who comes after us. I know who carries the will. He patted Luffy's head. The flickering of Luffy's body returned, more violent this time. His hand disappeared completely for a few seconds before reappearing. Using that power had accelerated the instability. We don't have much time, Roger said, standing up. We need to get the last road poneglyph. We need to get you to Laugh Tale before time corrects itself and pulls you back. The crew scrambled into action, motivated by a new purpose. They weren't just pirates anymore. They were the escorts of the future king. They were paving the way for Joy Boy. As the Oro Jackson sailed towards the final coordinates, the fog cleared days later, revealing an island not marked on any map. It was an island that sang with the voice of the universe. Laugh Tale. Roger stood at the bow, trembling with excitement. Luffy stood next to him, his body fading in and out like a ghost. We made it, kid, Roger said. Let's see the treasure. Let's see the joke that turned the world upside down. Together, the two kings stepped onto the sand of the final island. But as they walked towards the center where the treasure lay, Luffy felt a force pulling him back. The world began to blur. The colors of the past were washing away. Wait, Luffy yelled, reaching out. I want to see it. I want to see the One Piece with you. Roger turned around, smiling that famous grin. You will, Luffy. You will find it in your own time. And when you do laugh for me. Luffy's vision went white. The last thing he saw was Gol D Roger throwing his head back and laughing as he stood before the greatest treasure in the world. The sound of that laughter echoed through time, chasing Luffy as he was hurled back through the void, back to the storm, back to the Thousand Sunny where his crew was waiting terrified. Luffy crashed onto the deck of the Sunny Wet and gasping for air. The storm was gone. The sky was blue. Sanji ran over, shaking him. "Luffy, where did you go? You vanished for a second. Just a second." To Luffy, it had been weeks. He looked at his hand, the hand that had held a cup of sake with the Pirate King. He looked at the horizon towards where Laugh Tale would be. He didn't bring back gold or weapons, but he brought back a certainty. He adjusted his straw hat, the hat that had traveled through time, and grinned. "I know what we have to do," he whispered. And somewhere across the vast ocean, the ghost of a laugh answered him on the wind. The adventure was far from over. It was just beginning.